All right, so welcome back. We're going to talk now about partial pressures, the Bohr effect, the Haldane effect, and then gas exchange. If my slide advances. All right. So here we have partial pressure and gas exchange, and so let's just kind of take a look at this. So here we have our alveoli, right? Remember, we're taking in air, and we're going to be expiring carbon dioxide. So let's take a look at the oxygen in this image. So most of the oxygen is going to be picked up by our red blood cells, and very little is going to be actually dissolved in our plasma. Remember, it does not have a high solubility coefficient, right? It goes back to the left atrium, left ventricle, through the aorta to whatever tissue cells, right? It makes it down to the capillary level, wherever it's ended up. And down at that capillary level, there are some systemic tissue cells, whatever muscle cells or whatever cell that might be, that requires the oxygen. And so the oxygen is going to be given off by the red blood cell, and carbon dioxide will be picked up instead. So carbon dioxide, most of it is going to be dissolved in the bloodstream in the form of bicarbonate. About 23%, about a quarter of that will be picked up by the red blood cells, and then about 7% is simply dissolved in the bloodstream as in the form of carbon dioxide. Right, that goes back to the right atrium, right ventricle, out the pulmonary trunk, back to the lungs, and then you can see, again, that's going to be given off into the alveoli, and that is what you are breathing out. Okay, so basically carbon dioxide and oxygen are diffusing from areas that are higher partial pressure to low partial pressure, right? So there's lots of carbon dioxide here, meaning the partial pressure is greater, so it goes from high to low. Lots of oxygen here, again, it goes from high to low, right? Come on, slide. All right. So what affects the rate of diffusion of gases? Okay, well, one, the partial pressure of the gases, right? So alveolar oxygen has to be higher than blood oxygen. Okay, if the partial pressures are the same for whatever reason, like, I don't know, you're stuck in the typical movie scenario where most of the oxygen in the safe has been used up, well, you're going to suffocate. Okay. The greater the difference in partial pressure, the faster the difference. So we saw that. So like if you increase partial pressure, it'll diffuse faster. Okay. A lot of surface area is going to be very important. That's the point of those alveoli, those little air sacs, the increased surface area, which allows more blood vessels to come into contact, which allows for more gas exchange to occur. The diffusion distance is very small. We're talking simple squamous epithelium, so things can pass through very easily. Again, we talk about the solubility coefficient, as well as the molecular weight of gases. Smaller gases, smaller molecules tend to diffuse faster than large ones. Okay. So again, oxygen is a little bit smaller, so diffuses a little bit faster, but carbon dioxide dissolves more easily in water. I'm not sure why my computer is giving me a hard time advancing slides. Here we go. All right. We already mentioned this. Vast majority of the oxygen is being carried by the hemoglobin. Right? Remember back to blood earlier in the semester, or a few weeks ago. So basically when it's bound to the hemoglobin, we call that oxyhemoglobin. And most of carbon dioxide, again, is dissolved as in the form of bicarbonate. All right, we have a partial pressure curve here. So again, what's going to be really important here is going to be the partial pressure of oxygen. So what we're seeing here is an exponential curve. So let me try to explain this to you. Okay, so here in this purple dotted line, that's about the partial pressure of oxygen. So let me back up. Partial pressure of oxygen is here on the x-axis, and the percent saturation of hemoglobin is on the y. So how much oxygen is actually bound to red blood cells is on the y-axis. Okay. So what we're seeing here when in like a skeletal muscle, right, the partial pressure of oxygen is very low, and therefore a lot of the red blood cells have given off their oxygen to those muscles. So basically the hemoglobin of the red blood cells is not very saturated because they've released a lot of oxygen. Okay. Deoxygenated blood levels in systemic veins, so this is at rest, is higher. Okay, and then arteries, it's the highest still. So we kind of have to look at this curve going, instead of our typical left to right, we need to look at it right to left, right? Because we just came back from the lungs, and now we've went back to the left atrium, left ventricle, out the aorta, into the systemic arteries. We are traveling and we're giving off oxygen as we go. So here it is in veins, and then you can see we very easily give off oxygen, particularly when we get to those lower partial pressures. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense to you. And then this kind of goes in both directions. So when you go back to the lungs, and that very first molecule of oxygen binds to the heme, it makes the second molecule of oxygen even easier to pick up than the third and the fourth, right? So hopefully that makes sense to you. Okay. All right. So other things that are going to affect the affinity for hemoglobin are going to be acidity, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, temperature, and something called BPG. And these are really fairly straightforward. I mean, think about what we just saw, right? So in those muscles, those are active muscles, that's where we're giving off the oxygen. That makes sense, right? They're the ones that need it. Well, if you are working muscles, right, you're not just taking up oxygen, but you're producing carbon dioxide, right? So that'll be another trigger to release oxygen. Not only that, we said a few videos ago, that the more carbon dioxide we have, the more acidic something becomes, right? So kind of these two go hand in hand. So if you have lots of carbon dioxide, things are going to be acidic. And think about it, working muscles are usually hotter than muscles at rest. I mean, you sweat, right? So all three of these are basically hallmarks of simply things that are metabolically active. Not necessarily muscles, it can be any kind of tissue, okay? So simply as acidity increases, oxygen's affinity for hemoglobin decreases, and oxygen dissociates more readily from hemoglobin. This is called the Bohr effect, actually. All this is saying is that as we get to an area that has more carbon dioxide, there's more acidity. This affinity for hemoglobin, that's how tightly bound oxygen is to hemoglobin. So it's no longer going to be as tightly bound because, again, you need to deliver it to the tissues. So it dissociates, it detaches easier from hemoglobin. And that is called the Bohr effect. Okay. So about 70 to 90% of carbon dioxide reacts with water to form carbonic acid, which then dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. So again, more carbon dioxide we have, the more hydrogen ions we will also have. Okay. And it's just the same thing, just I have everything color-coded for you. So again, bicarbonate is in red, hydrogen ions are in blue. Okay. And remember, if we have a blood pH lower than 7.3, remember, right, we have that very tight range, 7.3 or 7.35 to 7.45. Anything lower than that 7.35, we call that acidosis, right? And if you don't like this graph, don't worry so much about it. This is just everything that's been said in graph form. So what you're looking at here in black, that's your normal pH of blood. So average of 7.4 is what they're giving you. And then if you have a high pH, so for example, if you're hyperventilating, you'd have a high pH of blood. And basically all that's showing is that at high pH, you're not going to give off as much oxygen because, again, of the partial pressure differences. Versus at low pH, you're going to give off more oxygen off those red blood cells. They're going to release them more readily. They're going to dissociate more readily because, again, that low pH indicates that you're having metabolically active tissue, and that is where oxygen needs to be delivered. Okay, so here's sort of an image of that. What's going on here, so here we have a tissue, so we're in the blood plasma, tissue, working tissue cell, this is in the lungs. So here's our red blood cell. Here's carbon dioxide, it's coming in, it's going to bind to water, there's the carbonic anhydrase, it ends up forming the bicarbonate, and basically some of the carbon dioxide will also bind to the hemoglobin. We call that carb amino hemoglobin. It does not bind to the same place as oxygen does, so it does not compete with oxygen for transport. So that's kind of nice. Okay, but what we're seeing here is as it does that, right, we have this bicarbonate that's being formed. That hydrogen that also forms will bind to the hemoglobin, that's what you're seeing here, which will cause the oxygen to dissociate, right? So wherever you have lots of carbon dioxide, you're going to have the hydrogen ions, they'll bind in the red blood cell and causing oxygen to dissociate and be delivered to the cells where they need to be. Okay? So basically a lowered pH drives oxygen off the hemoglobin and makes more oxygen available to the tissues where it needs to be. Okay. On the other hand, so on this image right here, now we're in the lungs. So in the lungs we have lots of oxygen, right? So again, down the partial pressure, so oxygen crosses from the lungs onto the red blood cell, and again, because of those partial pressure differences, it now causes the hydrogen ion to dissociate, and the hydrogen ion will bind to the bicarbonate, and that equation goes toward the toward the left, giving off carbon dioxide into the lungs. Hope that makes sense to you. This transfer, by the way, bicarbonate goes out into the plasma due to a concentration gradient. There's lots of bicarbonate that ends up being formed inside the red blood cell, so it simply diffuses out of the red blood cell into the plasma. But to basically keep the net charge, electrical charge the same, chloride ions basically move into the cell. So if you lose a negative, you gain a negative, so the net charge doesn't change. We call that the chloride shift. And then here it's simply the opposite. Basically, due to concentration gradient differences, the bicarbonate comes back into the red blood cell, and then the equation goes back toward the left. You gain a negative, you're going to end up having to boot chloride out. That's called the reverse chloride shift. Make sure you are aware of that chloride shift as well. We're going to end up talking about it even more detail when we get to the digestive system and the kidneys. Okay. So the other thing that's going on here is that because red blood cells are holding on to the hydrogen ions until they can be released in the lungs as part of water vapor, the hemoglobin is actually going to act as a buffer in your body for hydrogen ions. Okay, and we'll see a little bit more of this. Just keep that in mind. We'll see a little bit more of this when we get to ions and pH after the urinary system. So this is just what I just said. Okay. So this is all that dissociation curve. Don't worry so much about it. We just talked about it. That's really the main important thing. Again, depending on your textbook, these numbers will vary. So about anywhere from 5 to 10% of carbon dioxide, it's transported in the blood as dissolved gas, kind of like what you would see in soda. It's like a carbonated beverage, that's what that is. Again, depending on textbooks, they give wide ranges, depending which one you consult. Anywhere from 5 to 20% will bind to the amino group of the globin in hemoglobin, forming that carb amino hemoglobin. Again, this is non-competitive, does not affect oxygen binding to the red blood cells. Okay. But the vast majority is going to be bound as the bicarbonate ion, as we saw in the video. Okay. So now we get to something called that Haldane effect, and we already discussed this, so this, again, one more time. So the Haldane effect simply says the lower the partial pressure of oxygen and the lower the extent of hemoglobin saturation with oxygen, the more carbon dioxide that can be carried by the hemoglobin. Okay, so simply we're unloading oxygen at the site of tissue that's using it up, and therefore more of it can then attach to the red blood cell. So as carbon dioxide enters the bloodstream, it causes more oxygen to dissociate from the hemoglobin. That was the Bohr effect we just saw a little while ago. That allows more carbon dioxide to combine with hemoglobin and more bicarbonate to be formed, and that's something called the Haldane effect. Okay. Let me know if any of that is confusing to you. Okay. And again, if you don't like this graph, don't worry about it. Simply as temperature increases, more oxygen is being released. Okay. Again, metabolic activity starts producing heat, so it causes more oxygen to be released. Okay. And then this BPG, this bisphosphoglycerate, oh, can't talk today. This is basically one of the byproducts resulting from energy production in red blood cells, and it also causes oxygen unloading. Okay. All right, and I'm going to stop that right here. And this is one of the trickier sections in the respiratory system, so please, if you have any questions, let me know and I will get back to you. Okay? See you guys next time.